At 10 a.m. on Tuesday morning, I knew I had lost control. I had no more battalions or companies, just single tanks fighting for survival by themselves. I called Eitan on the radio and asked to retreat. In my previous video, I described the Battle of the Golan Heights in the south, from Saturday 5th to Monday night 7th of October 1973. But what happened during this time at the north sector? The Quneitra Valley is a large plateau, almost 15 kilometers wide, suitable as if by design for large tank offensives. Israel held two hills overlooking the valley. One was the Hermonite Mountain, the second was the Booster Ridge. This is what the valley looked like from the Syrian side. In all the war games Israel conducted before the war, it was clear the main Syrian effort would be in this region. 3 days before the war, the IDF Chief of Staff finally got permission from the Minister of Defense to reinforce the Golan with the 7th Tank Brigade. When the war broke out, the 74th Battalion from the 188th Brigade was responsible for the north sector, from Post 109 to Post 104. The 53rd Battalion was in charge of the south. The 7th Brigade had the 82nd, 77th, and 75th Battalions. Since Bengal received the 71st Battalion from the tank school, he was ordered to send the 82nd Battalion to help in the south. On Saturday afternoon, the North Sector commander, Bengal, had about 154 tanks at his disposal. At 5 minutes to 2, under heavy artillery barrage, the Syrian special tanks cleared the mines and breached the anti-tank ditches. In the evening, Syria's 52nd Infantry Brigade managed to get some forces beyond the border. The Syrians' 85th Brigade bridged the anti-tank ditches in the center, and the Moroccan Brigade plus the 68th Infantry Division did the same in the north. The 52nd Battalion had some success and managed to get a few dozen tanks west of the border. At nightfall, the Syrian 68th and 85th Brigades used their night vision capabilities to get closer to the Israeli tank positions. While IDF artillery ran out of star shells by midnight, small fires from damaged tanks and the dry vegetation gave off enough light for the Israelis to defend against the Syrian night attacks. The Syrians prepared extremely well for the offensive and used the terrain to advance. This is what it looked like from the Hermonite Hill. The dried creek called Shabrak is mostly hidden from the hill, making it easy for Syrian tanks to advance close enough to the point beyond which the Israeli centurions will not be able to lower their guns. And this is what it looked like from the Booster Ridge. Even though one can have a good view of the valley, hidden creeks and small hills will have obscured most of the town columns. Since the Israeli defense at the south of the Golan crumbled at the first day of the war, all reinforcement the IDF could muster was sent to the south. The regular IDF tanks had to make do with what they had. Without getting into too much detail, after 3 days of bitter fighting, the Syrian army still failed to gain ground in the north. By Monday night, the Syrians were also driven out of the ground they gained in the south. For Assad, this was alarming. While the Egyptians looked content with their achievement in Sinai, it was clear the attention of Israel would be dedicated wholly to Syria. Assad had to gamble on some ground gain before the IDF tanks will threaten Damascus, barely 40 kilometers away from the border. According to official Syrian sources on Monday, Omer el-Abrash, the 7th Division commander, died attacking the enemy. Less official sources, and probably more reliable ones, stated that he was executed by an Alawi officer sent to replace him. All through Monday night, Syrian commando, equipped with Sagers and RPGs, infiltrated the valley. They attacked the Israeli night positions, which had to give up on refilling the tanks or sleep after 3 days of continuous fire. By Tuesday morning, the Syrians began the worst artillery barrage of the war, raising clouds of dust and smoke. With the sun in their eyes, the 55 Israeli tanks remaining from the original force couldn't fire back and had to retreat from the higher ground. Almost without interruption, The Syrians attacked in three efforts. First in the south, by the 52nd Infantry Brigade, and by the 43rd Tank Brigade. The second, in the north, was undertaken by the 68th Infantry Brigade, the Moroccan Brigade, and the Independent Tank Battalion from Assad's Republican Guard tank force. Those brigades attacked the Israeli tanks at Mount Hermonite. The third and main attack was at the center, with the 85th Infantry, 78th Armored, 121st Mechanized, and the fresh 81st Tank Brigade from the 3rd Armored Division. Overall, an estimated 170 tanks and an unknown number of armored vehicles attacked simultaneously. From the first hours of the attack, the Israeli tanks were overwhelmed. Dust and smoke from the heavy bombardment covered the valley, as well as direct sunlight, which prevented an official targeting of Syrian tanks that slowly gained ground and took hold of the position previously held by Israeli tanks. So effective was the Syrian rolling barrage that in some cases the range of fire was just a few tens of meters, point blank in tank terms. The 9th Company fired at the tanks coming from the Shabrak Creek. South side, 8th Company fired at the Syrians' 43rd and 52nd Brigades. The 75th Battalion held the center with 25 tanks. It is unclear whether it was lack of ammunition or if the pressure was just too much, but by 8:30 the Israeli line started to give way. Ben-Gal now faced a brutal dilemma. If he kept his forces, he would soon be surrounded and decimated. Organized retreat to the second line of defense would be very difficult under such enemy fire. It would mean leaving behind the higher ground, not to mention the moral effect on his exhausted crews. After a few nerve-wracking minutes, Ben-Gal chose a third option. He decided to double down. He called Kahalani and gave him command of the entire valley. While Kahalani, with 8 tanks, closed the distance to the front, Ben-Gal asked his strategic reserve force of 3 tanks to join in and called Retis, the 71st Battalion commander, who was firing on the Syrians from the Hermonite mountain. He ordered him to assist the weakened defense at the center. Retis immediately understood what it meant for his 4 tanks to charge the mass in front of him. "It's a suicide mission," he said. "If it wasn't an order from you, I wouldn't do it." Ben-Gal had no choice. If the Syrians would reach the Kunet-Ramasada road, the 7th Brigade would be outflanked and lost. Retis managed to hit 3 Syrian T-62s before he was killed in his tank. In an act of despair, Ben-Gal ordered Kahalani to take back the higher ground on the Booster Ridge. Ben-Gal feared his forces will crumble down. If it will happen, nothing would stop the Syrians from taking control of the sector and probably the rest of the Golan. He called Eitan, the 36th Division commander, and asked to retreat. At 10 a.m. on Tuesday morning, I knew I had lost control. I had no more battalions or companies, just single tanks fighting for survival by themselves. Eitan urged him to hold on for a few more minutes until Ben Hanan could assemble 11 tanks that remained from what used to be the 188th Brigade. As the Syrian rolling barrage slowly decreased, Kahalani could see the first Syrian tanks slowly taking hold of the ridge, and behind them, the rest of the 81st Tank Brigade. Kahalani ordered his 8 remaining tanks under the ridge to charge, just to notice that no one moved. Once again he gave the order, and saw his exhausted crews after 4 days of continuous fire were not that keen to charge a numerically superior enemy on higher ground. In his desperation, he shouted down the radio, "Take a good look at the Syrians. See how brave they are." Finally, his tanks moved forward with him. The battle that took place on the ridge looked like a tank version of a Western shootout, with tanks shooting at each other at point blank behind boulders and from all sides. At the end of the charge, Kahalani, with only 4 tanks remaining, took control of the ridge. At the valley below, there were first signs of Syrian attack breaking down. Tanks started to retreat, and tank crews jumped out of their tanks looking for cover on the ground. By 11 a.m., it was clear the Syrian attack has failed. After 4 days of continuous fire, there were no more Syrian tanks at the Israeli side of the Golan. More than any other battle of the war, this battle captivated the Israeli public. It epitomized how the politicians' hubris left a group of young men, barely in their 20s, to fight against all odds and save a nation from catastrophe. The price, however, was immense. Hundreds were killed and thousands were injured. Almost an entire generation of officers and tank crews was lost.